Good afternoon. It is Monday, May 17, 2023. This is not the video I talked about doing on the two powers in heaven. I'm still working on that. It may just be one long video. It may be a couple of videos. But in the meantime, as certain subjects sort of come up in my head, when I have thoughts to share, I'm just going to put out these individual videos on a variety of different questions. So this is not a Trinity video per se, but it does pertain directly to the doctrine of God in Christianity, particularly Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is what we've primarily been interacting with. And it has to do with the distinction in Orthodoxy between God's essence and his uncreated energies. One of the things that I mentioned in passing in my longer video showing how person, nature, and energy correspond in Sanatana Dharma is that, I think it was towards the end of the video where I kind of just briefly mentioned that Christianity is ultimately materialistic in its dualism, in the same way, while being quote-unquote spiritual, in the same way that the modern quantum physics theory of Panpsychism still ultimately remains materialistic while trying to compromise with consciousness, scholars in consciousness studies. And by the way, there was a very recent discovery by the James Webb Telescope that just definitively debunks the Big Bang theory, which I've never subscribed to. And now the scientific community is all abuzz because apparently the nature of the evidence that undermines the Big Bang theory is suggesting very strongly that time itself does not exist. And since time and the notion of space are codependent, that would mean space does not technically exist. Well, Hindus and Buddhists could have told you this probably 1,000,000 years ago. So they're kind of looking at each other, winking and smiling because they've always known this. Again, space, distance, things like that, time is just a perception because we experience consciousness in terms of frames of reference, and it appears to be occurring sequentially in the sense of there appears to be a progression of that which we call time. Now, this is a totally separate subject, so I'll just stop myself there. But I wanted to point out, because I thought that would be of interest to people listening, but consciousness studies is really going somewhere now, and it's taking science by storm, even though it takes a little while to get scientists to admit that they might be wrong. Well, that's going to be accelerated now with this new discovery. But anyway, this notion of Panentheism in Christian theology, it's particularly prominent in Eastern Orthodoxy, especially when you see in the liturgy where it specifically says that God is everywhere present and filleth all things, right? Panentheism, God is in all things, but yet they maintain the ex nihilo doctrine of God creating everything out of nothing, and God and creation not being identical with one another. So the creation is not divine, even though divinity fills it and interpenetrates it, even though the uncreated divine energies are diffused throughout all things. Those things, those objects, in and of themselves, think of the smallest particle, right? The particles are not in themselves divine, but they are filled with divinity. So there's still a separateness there. There's still a duality between God and creation. This is no different from materialists in the scientific community who are now making concessions to consciousness philosophers and making concessions to Far Eastern religion, but want to not give up entirely the notion that matter does nevertheless still have standalone existence. So panpsychism basically says that what we see, what we observe as physical objects, are not simply the configurations that consciousness takes in terms of higher or lower vibrational frequencies, but rather material objects still have standalone existence, and they are simply filled with consciousness. So every individual object has its own sort of packet, quote unquote, of consciousness buried deep inside it. Again, it's materialism. And so I submit to you that Panentheism is just as materialistic as Panpsychism. The two terms, the only thing that differentiates them is the community that uses them. So the only reason why these terms are different is because the scientific community uses one of them, prefers Panpsychism, whereas the theologians prefer the term Panentheism. But it's the same thing, and it ultimately reduces to materialism, which ultimately reduces to atheism, right? Ironically enough. So, but this brings me to the immediate reason for starting this video, which is to talk about the fact, just very briefly, of the irony that Christianity does not allow for there to be more than a few persons in the Trinity, right? And yet, the Orthodox position is that there are literally an infinite number of distinct energies. So in that respect, the energies are just like the persons, in the sense that they are both distinct from the divine essence and distinct one from another. They are related to the essence, but they are not identical with it, which is exactly what we can say about the hypostases. That is the claim they make for the hypostases. Now, why there can be an infinite number of divine energies, but there must be a finite number of hypostases is beyond me. It seems pretty fucking arbitrary to me. But who am I, right? But it's a good question. Why can you have, why can you have an infinite number of energies, but you cannot have an infinite number of persons? What is the quality? What is that quality or characteristic or attribute that distinguishes person from energy such that there can be an infinite number of energies within the Godhead, but there can only be a finite number of persons in the Godhead? And that leads to the second point, which is, again, which I've made repeatedly from different angles and perspectives, that if in fact God were infinite, literally infinite, the cosmos would be divine as per Dharma, Sanatana Dharma. But it isn't. They want to maintain this strict duality between the material world and God the Creator. So, they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. They want God to be infinite in terms of the uncreated energies, but they want to maintain a strict doctrine of creation out of nothing, a strict dualism, and you cannot have your cake and eat it too. I'm sorry. So that's another place where Christianity falters and really loses track of its own argumentation. There are literally so many arguments, so many holes they have to plug to sound reasonable and to sound plausible that they lose track of what they said over here when they say this over here, right? And so you just end up with one contradiction after another. So that pretty much summarizes my purpose for producing this video, and I'll see you on the flip side with hopefully either another video like this or the first installment, possibly the only installment, depending on how long it goes, of the two powers in heaven subject there.